Rain lashed against the windows, each drop sounding like tiny hammers against the glass. Wind howled like a banshee, its eerie wail echoing through the empty streets and rattling the trees. Thunder rattled the old building, shaking its very foundations and making the walls creak ominously. Emma huddled deeper into her armchair, a book trembling in her hands. She could feel the vibrations of the storm through the floorboards. She tried to focus on the words, but the storm kept stealing her attention. The howling wind and crashing thunder made it impossible to concentrate. Each flash of lightning illuminated her cozy living room with an unnatural, almost ghostly glow. Shadows danced on the walls, creating eerie shapes. A particularly violent gust shook the window panes, making them rattle as if they might shatter at any moment. Emma jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. She clutched the book tighter, seeking comfort in its familiar weight. She glanced nervously at the large antique mirror hanging on the wall opposite her. The mirror seemed to shimmer in the dim light. It was just a trick of the light, she told herself, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She took a deep breath and looked away. But for a moment she could have sworn she saw a dark figure lurking in the mirror's reflection, a shape that wasn't there before. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Emma forced her gaze back to her book. Her pulse quickened. She couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling that something was watching her. She snuck another peek at the mirror. This time, there was no mistaking it. A tall, shadowy figure stood just behind her, its form indistinct, its edges blurring into the darkness around it. She blinked, and the figure was gone. Emma shivered. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She told herself it was just her imagination, playing tricks on her in the flickering light. But deep down, a cold, terrifying thought took root. What if it was real? Another ear-splitting crash of thunder made Emma jump. She slammed her book shut and stood up, her heart racing. She kept her eyes fixed on the mirror as she slowly backed away. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. The figure was back. This time it was closer. She could make out more details now. It was tall and skeletal, with long, claw-like fingers that seemed to twitch with a life of their own. Its eyes, two burning embers in the darkness, locked onto hers. A wave of pure terror washed over Emma. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Section 4. Trapped in terror, nowhere to hide. Emma stumbled backward, her eyes never leaving the terrifying apparition in the mirror. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears like a drum. She could feel the cold sweat trickling down her back. Her mind racing to comprehend the horror unfolding before her, she felt trapped, paralyzed by fear. The figure began to move, sliding out of the mirror's reflection and into the room. It was as if the boundary between reality and nightmare had shattered, and Emma was caught in the middle of it. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate, and menacing, each step sending a shiver down her spine. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding silently across the floor towards her. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. The figure's eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to bore into her soul, stripping away any semblance of safety or comfort. With each step it took, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The once warm and familiar space now felt like a frozen tomb. Emma could see her breath in the air, each exhale a visible reminder of the chilling dread that enveloped her. The air grew heavy, thick with a suffocating dread. Emma's breath came in short, panicked gasps. It felt as though the very atmosphere was pressing down on her, squeezing the life out of her lungs. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls inching closer with every heartbeat. She wanted to run, to scream for help, but her body refused to obey her commands. Her legs felt like lead, her voice caught in her throat. The terror was so overwhelming that it rendered her completely immobile, a prisoner in her own body. She was frozen in place, a rabbit caught in the headlights of an oncoming car. The figure drew closer, its presence a dark cloud of malevolence. Emma's mind screamed for her to move, to do anything to escape. But all she could do was stand there, paralyzed by the sheer terror of the moment. Section 5. Vanished without a trace, only silence remains. The figure was almost upon her now, its presence a looming shadow that seemed to swallow the light around it. Emma closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing like a drum in the silence. She could feel the cold air around her, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. She waited for the touch of its icy fingers, for the searing pain she knew was coming. Every second felt like an eternity, her mind racing with thoughts of escape, yet her body frozen in place. But it never came. She slowly opened her eyes, her breath hitching in her throat. The room was eerily quiet, the oppressive silence almost deafening. The figure was gone. The room was empty, as if it had never been there. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the flickering light of a lone candle. The only sound was the now waning storm outside. The wind howled through the trees and rain tapped against the window like 1,000 tiny fingers. Emma cautiously approached the mirror, her steps slow and deliberate. Each step felt like a journey, her fear growing with every inch she closed between herself and the reflective surface. Her reflection stared back at her, her eyes wide with terror. She could see the fear etched into every line of her face, the uncertainty that gripped her heart. She reached out a trembling hand to touch the smooth surface. Her fingers hovered just inches away, the air around them feeling charged with electricity. As her fingers made contact, she felt a sudden sharp pain, like 1,000 needles piercing her skin. It was as if the mirror itself was alive, reacting to her touch with a violent shudder. She cried out, jerking her hand back. The pain was intense, leaving her fingers tingling and her heart racing. She stumbled backward, her eyes never leaving the mirror. And then just as suddenly, she was gone. The room seemed to swallow her whole, leaving nothing but an empty space where she had stood moments before. The mirror stood alone, its surface undisturbed. It was as if it had never been touched, the glass smooth and cold, reflecting the empty room back at itself. The only evidence that Emma had ever existed was the faint, lingering chill in the air and a single, blood-red lipstick stain on the cold glass. The room felt colder, the air heavier, as if it held the weight of her disappearance.